The Common Standards watchdog should hold Nigel Farage to account over his dangerous comments following the week's violent disorder in the wake of the Southport murders, a Liverpool MP has said. Kim Johnson, Labour MP for Liverpool Riverside, said Farage's comments cannot be left to fester and should be examined by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner. Farage has released 2 videos since 3 children were murdered in Southport last week. In the first, he questioned whether the police were withholding information about who was responsible for the murders. It came at a time when false information was circulating on social media that a Muslim asylum seeker was responsible, which fueled disorder at a mosque in Southport. In a second video, Farage challenged Keir Starmer's argument that the violent protests were the fault of the far right, saying it was a reaction to fear, to discomfort, to unease that is out there, shared by tens of millions of people. Lee Anderson, the Reform MP and former Tory deputy chair, made a similar argument, writing on X, "This problem has been caused by smug politicians who have refused to listen to the concerns of British people. It has festered, and now it has boiled over. Parliament must listen, Parliament must act." But it must not blame the British people. He also referred to the Prime Minister as Keir Stalin in reference to the Soviet dictator. The Common Standards watchdog should hold Nigel Farage to account over his dangerous comments following the week's violent disorder in the wake of the Southport murders, a Liverpool MP has said. Kim Johnson, Labour MP for Liverpool Riverside, said Farage's comments cannot be left to fester and should be examined by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner. Farage has released 2 videos since 3 children were murdered in Southport last week. In the first, he questioned whether the police were withholding information about who was responsible for the murders. It came at a time when false information was circulating on social media that a Muslim asylum seeker was responsible, which fueled disorder at a mosque in Southport. In a second video, Farage challenged Keir Starmer's argument that the violent protests were the fault of the far right, saying it was a reaction to fear, to discomfort, to unease that is out there, shared by tens of millions of people. The weekend scenes of encircled mosques guarded by police and hotels accommodating asylum seekers attacked by mobs intent on violence were among the most disturbing seen on British streets for many years. In their scope and intensity, these riots were of a different order from relatively isolated incidents in the past, such as the petrol bomb attack on a Dover immigration center in 2022. In Rotherham, where a group of rioters broke into a Holiday Inn and attempted to set the building on fire, the bravery of outnumbered police averted a potential tragedy. Responsibility for this horror naturally lies with the perpetrators, who exploited the tragic murder of 3 girls in Southport last week as a convenient pretext for xenophobic violence. It is, as Sir Keir Starmer clearly intends, imperative that they are swiftly seen to suffer the consequences of such thuggery in court. It will not, however, be sufficient to address these events primarily through the legal lens of violent disorder and criminality. In Southport and places such as Sunderland and Stoke, hundreds of rioters mobilized through social media brought the spirit of the far-right pogrom to the streets of our towns and cities. In Middlesbrough, masked youths targeted an area with a large immigrant population, smashing the windows of houses and car windscreens. These actions were a challenge to Britain's peaceful multi-ethnic identity. As Dame Sarah Khan, the independent advisor for social cohesion and resilience under Rishi Sunak, told this newspaper, that did not come about in a political vacuum. According to MS, Khan's own research, the inflammatory rhetoric deployed by successive conservative governments in relation to immigration has palpably nourished extremism on the ground. You just see extremists co-opting that, she notes. You see people saying, well, if politicians can use that language, why can't we? Nigel Farage's insidious manipulation of social media is further contributing to this merging of horizons between reform, parts of a radicalized conservative party, and the extra-parliamentary far right. Thankfully, the likes of Suella Braverman, who as Home Secretary described irregular migration as an invasion and later suggested that Islamists were now running Britain, will not be in office anytime soon. But the pious condemnation of the violence by senior conservative figures sits uneasily with their party's relentless framing of immigration as a menace to the nation. It also leaves Labour with a task that goes far beyond the rapid administration of criminal justice in the courts. As MS Khan argues, ineffective legislation permits pernicious racist narratives to be freely propagated, particularly on social media. This lacuna in our extremist laws must finally be addressed. Just as importantly, the mainstreaming and normalization of far-right discourse on immigration in Britain, as elsewhere in Europe, is a political fact that requires a response. The reality of Britain as a multicultural society needs to be defended and celebrated, both rhetorically and through the provision of real resources and support to challenged areas. As has been said many times in the aftermath of Southport, The overwhelming majority of Britons will view the events of the past few days with utter revulsion. But the riots are also evidence that the ideas of the far right have gained much more than a foothold in our national politics. It will perhaps be the most important task for this new Labour government to take on. The more than 100 far-right gatherings that were expected to take place on Wednesday failed to materialize following the mobilization of 6,000 riot officers and the deterrent effect of the swift arrests and court appearances of those accused of participating in the weekend's violence. What few small, far-right-led gatherings there were took place only in Durham, Blackpool, Norwich, Northampton, Sheffield, and Brighton. Police were previously preparing for far-right action all over the country after a list of targets connected to asylum and immigration was circulated on social media. Instead, thousands of anti-racism protesters held their own counter-rallies everywhere from Newcastle to Bristol to Birmingham, London, and Brighton. They formed human shields to protect asylum centers and waved placards saying refugees welcome and reject racism, try therapy. While there were some reports of tensions flaring, some skirmishes in Blackpool and a clash in Aldershot in Hampshire between a group chanting "Stop the boats" and demonstrators who had been chanting "Refugees are welcome here." Wednesday's rallies were a far cry from the violence, looting, and destruction that led many businesses across the country to close up early and board up their shops in recent days. Mel Stride, who is running to be Conservative Party leader, is speaking to Sky News this morning. Asked about rival Robert Jenrick's comments yesterday that people chanting Allahu Akbar should be arrested. Mr. Stride says he disagrees. He then moves to attack Nigel Farage over the Reform UK leader's response to the Southport stabbings in which 3 little girls were killed. His suggestion that the police might have not been telling the truth about that situation, I think, helped fuel conspiracy theories around what was happening, was deeply unhelpful. I think linking what happened in Southport with the terrible incident that happened regarding a uniformed soldier in Kent over the last week is also a very unfortunate linkage, and particularly suggesting that perhaps terrorism might have been involved when the authorities are saying that it hasn't. Far-right rioters have been deterred by the administration of swift justice, the policing minister has said, as she warned there would be further arrests and charges brought against suspects. Anti-racist demonstrators fill a street with flags and a placard reading "This is what community looks like." Diana Johnson said the de-escalation of violence on Wednesday night was just the start and argued that the speedy mobilization of police officers had had a deterrent effect. Shops were boarded up across the country in response to the threat of more than 100 planned anti-immigration protests, but in most places these failed to materialize after thousands of peaceful anti-racism demonstrators turned out. Johnson told BBC Breakfast that the counter-demonstrations showed the UK's tradition of peaceful protest. The police response, the numbers, the mobilization that we've seen to get the police officers onto our streets and to be available if disorder occurs is really important and has had a good effect. The response then of the police in terms of arresting people who were involved in criminal acts over the last week, bringing them into police stations, getting them charged, getting them then in front of a court. People are now going to prison for the acts they carried out on our streets in our last few days, the policing minister said. We saw one case yesterday of a man who punched a police officer going to prison for 3 years. So I think that swift justice is really important. She added over 400 people have been arrested. I'm hoping and I know that number will increase today. We've got over 140 people charged. That number will go up as well. We will start to see again today more people going into court and receiving sentences. More of those arrested in the unrest of the past week will appear on court on Thursday, including some likely to be jailed on live television. 3 men were jailed on Wednesday for up to 3 years after admitting violent disorder after riots in Liverpool city centre. Johnson said it's not just those physical acts on the street that we are going to make sure people are brought to account for, but it's also what's happening online. If you do stuff online, we will come for you just as much as we will come for you for what you do on the streets of our country, if you are carrying out criminal disorder and violence. Speaking to Sky News, Johnson welcomed the de-escalation of violence on Wednesday but said she was cautious about the days ahead. Obviously, this is just the start. There is now further intelligence of events during the next few days, and we need to see what happens there. Asked about a report in the iNewspaper that far-right rioters could be banned from football matches, Johnson told LBC all options are being looked at. The head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, said his officers had been conducting early morning raids on Thursday targeting people suspected of causing disorder in Whitehall last week.